Now, from CBS 4 News, this is Facing South Florida with Jim DeFede.
Good morning, I'm Jim DeFede, and welcome to Facing South Florida. I had the opportunity recently to sit down with the head of SOUTHCOM, Admiral Craig Fowler, at his headquarters here in Doral. SOUTHCOM oversees all U.S. military planning in South and Central America, as well as the Caribbean. SOUTHCOM is also responsible for coordinating drug interdiction at a joint base they have inside the Key West Naval Air Station. But we begin our conversation with the growing threat in our backyard, not only from Russia, but increasingly from China, which is pumping millions of dollars into Latin America, hoping to buy influence at a time when U.S. aid is being cut.
Well, the threats we face here in the United States are global threats. And it starts with the great power competition that our national defense strategy calls out. And that's great power competition with Russia and China. And how do we reconcile that for the future safety of South Florida, for the United States, and for the world? That also brings home here in this hemisphere where you see these great powers, the same sorts of conditions that allows them to do what they need to do or what they do for their own national interests. Fosters transnational criminal organizations, violent extremists, which is a word for terrorists, and these bad actors, these transnational actors, they thrive on corruption. They thrive on weak institutions, and so we work on building that institutional capacity with our partners. I call this a vicious circle. You've got young democracies in our neighborhood. They have, in many cases, weak institutions or young emerging institutions. Corruption is a problem. That corruption is rampant for transnational criminal organizations, and that same thing fosters that Russia and China thrive on.
It seems to me, though, that the objectives of Russia and China are a little different in Latin America, or do you disagree? It seems as if Russia's objectives tend to be more spoiler and antagonistic, and China's is a little bit more long range. Am I having that wrong?
I certainly, no, I think you've got it right on. Jim, you look at what Russia's up to, and it is seemingly, from our perspective, a military perspective, they're out to make the U.S. look bad and diminish U.S. influence at every turn in the road. China has legitimate economic interests. They're the #1 trading partner with some of our key partners in the region. They're the #1 trading partner with the United States. So they have legitimate economic interests. It's how they go about that puts us in competition.
I want to come back to oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Well, I don't ask partners to choose, Russia, China, the United States. I just ask them, who do you want to have as your partner? Do you want a partner that values democracy, values the rule of law, respects human rights, respects equal opportunity within their force, and has mutual respect? If that's a partnership you want, then I ask them to judge how they think Russia and China stack up on that scale versus the United States.
I want to come back to China in a couple minutes, but I want to stay with Russia for a second, particularly Russian influence as it relates to Venezuela, and open up a discussion about Venezuela. What is Russia's role in Venezuela, and how does it differentiate itself from Cuba's role in Venezuela?
Well, Russia is, if you look at Venezuela, and just a array of threats that have proliferated because of the lawlessness there, the migration, the narco-trafficking, violent extremists. So you look at what Cuba's doing. They're protecting Maduro. The Praetorian Guard is Cubans in the thousands. Then you look at Russians in the hundreds that are there for technical assistance on systems, keeping some of the defense systems up and operable in support of Maduro, and they're there across some of the business circles and in cyber as well.
Who's more vital to keeping Maduro in power, Cuba or Russia?
I think it's just interlocked. It's like an interlaced puzzle of bad influence from malign actors, Russia and Cuba.
You talk about the Praetorian Guard element of what Cuba provides to Maduro. Do I have this correct, that essentially his own even personal security forces that protect him are less Venezuelan and more Cuban?
Exactly right. It tells you something about how much he can trust his own people if he's got to surround himself with Cubans to stay in power.
I want to stay on Venezuela for a second. I want to take you back to April 30th of this year, or of, I guess, last year. I apologize. I'm still getting used to the 2020. I want to take you back to April 30th of 2019. That was the day that Juan Guaido went to the military base in Caracas and called for the military to rise up and to overthrow the Maduro government. What was it like here at SOUTHCOM seeing what was taking place in Venezuela?
Our role is in support of the U.S. government, whole government efforts, and it has been a whole government effort with the pressure, economic pressure, and we watched that very closely, and we were sharing what we could with our partners.
Did you know that he was going to do that in advance?
We have insight into what we think unfolds, and we were closely lashed in with Special Representative Elliott Abrams and the State Department as this moved forward.
Why do you think it didn't work? Why do you think the Venezuelan military did not rise up and fall in line in support of Guaido as he had called for?
You mentioned the Cubans and the Praetorian Guard. You mentioned the Russians and their malign influence. We also look at he has more generals than NATO has, and they're all, for the most part, on the take as best we can tell, and so they're looking at what their self-interest is, and is to stay aligned to Maduro. So that's a tough, complicated puzzle to crack apart. Look how long it took Chavez to ruin the country. And so we have to be thoughtful about how this unfolds into the future. So it can't happen fast enough, but we think and we're confident as Maduro becomes increasingly isolated that democracy is going to happen.
Were you personally surprised, though, that more didn't occur at that time?
I try not to be a predictor. I'm a planner. We take military factors. We look at what course of action might be. So I don't ever make predictions. I leave that for others.
Did we ever come close on those days to interceding militarily in support of Guaido?
From the beginning, this has been a diplomatic, democratic, economic effort. So the idea of how military factors and options might play in, we're a combatant command with the full range of capabilities of the United States Department of Defense. There's a lot of options out there, but the focus has always been economic and pressure through diplomacy.
Let's talk a little bit about Venezuela is also increasing in drug trafficking. They're increasing narco traffickers to be able to use Venezuela. And I want to talk about what exactly, or have you talk a little bit about the role that they're now playing in an increasing way in that way, and then lead that to a discussion a little bit more about the role that SOUTHCOM plays in drug interdiction. Is Venezuela emerging as a major narco trafficking country?
As we mentioned and discussed, Venezuela is essentially a lawless region. The laws are whatever keeps Maduro in power. So the narco trafficking is significantly up into Venezuela and then out. And Maduro, as well as the transnational criminal organizations, these drug lords are lining their pockets with that money, in addition to terrorism being up for the same reasons. The conditions are spawned for that inside Venezuela.
You mentioned Russian troops Russian assets that are in Venezuela. Are they merely technical in nature and supportive, or do they play a different sort of role as well?
There's a range of, the Russians that are in Venezuela have a range of functions, from technical to support to advise to training, and it covers the gamut of what helps keep Maduro in power.
Long-range bombers being based in Latin America by Russia?
Well, we've seen Russians fly them to Venezuela as a show of force, and we've brought the United States hospital ship Comfort, and we've brought our partners closer together. So who do you want to partner with is kind of the question. I think that the rest of the rest of the world and the region is pretty united against what's happening in Venezuela with Maduro.
You mentioned that a couple of times. Who do you want to partner with? I saw you had testified before a Senate subcommittee in July of last year, where you were talking. They were asking you where you have some lapses, may not be the right word that I think was used, but areas where you need greater resources. And I think one of the things that you had mentioned was, you had talked about, they asked you if you had the resources you need to project U.S. power in the region. We have, in some cases, adequate forces, which doesn't sound truly optimistic. You talked about a capability gap, and we are short on assets, yes. Is the United States playing with one hand behind its back in Latin America?
Well, the United States it's a global fight, and we're globally around the world. We're certainly not playing with one hand behind our backs. We've got a talented team here, headquartered at SOUTHCOM here in Doral, And we've got talented Army, Navy, Air Force, Special Operations, Marine forces that engage throughout the region. We've got to be on the field to compete. When I said adequate, that's a good term. We have what we need. We could use more. We could use some more additional assets, particularly in the intelligence arena where we want to learn and assess what the threats are up to.
You talk about asking countries also to make that choice. Do you side, all right, not asking them to make a choice. That, the United States is available to them. If they choose Russia, China, that's their decision to make. They're independent sovereign countries. But it seems to me that has U.S. policy made that argument harder? Particularly, I'm thinking of the countries in Central America, El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, when we saw early in 2019 aid being cut there. I know it was eventually restored, but when U.S. policy sort of gives short shrift to Latin America and Central America in particular, does that allow for an opening for places like Russia and more importantly China to step in and fill the void? We
focus on the mill-to-mill partnership, and I have not seen or noticed any diminishing in our ability to partner together mill-to-mill. It's been strong. We remain the partner of choice with these nations, and nations are stepping up, like Colombia. They are taking it to the FARC dissidents, the ELN, the narco traffickers, and that's saving lives in the United States and saving lives in Colombia.
What role is Cuba playing as it relates to the FARC rebels there?
Well, sort of by implication, they are not helpful, and there's connections to the leadership of these terrorist organizations in Cuba and in Venezuela, where the ELN and FARC dissidents' presence and numbers and bases of operation have all skyrocketed. Cuba is right in there, complicit in their operating bases.
Has Cuba's philosophy towards Latin America changed or evolved at all? Are they thinking of it differently strategically, since they're going through the economic problems that they have, the loss of sort of the Soviet Union supporting them? I guess I'm just wondering, is Cuba's ends the same as they always have been, or is there something, for lack of a better word, more strategic in how Cuba looks at what they do in Latin America?
One of the things about Latin America and the Caribbean is so much opportunity here. We got 28 democracies of 31 countries, and unfortunately, Cuba's at the top of the list of the 3 that aren't, followed by Nicaragua and Venezuela. And where you see democracy diminishing, and where we see struggles with these weak governments, you see Cuba having a very negative influence. And I don't see that that's changed, other than gotten worse.
When we come back, more of my interview with SOUTHCOM Commander Admiral Craig Fowler as we talk about allegations that President Trump belittled military commanders. The Washington Post book, A Very Stable Genius, describes a scene that took place in July 2017 in the tank, in which the president, during a briefing, dressed down Jim Mattis and a number of other generals and admirals that were in the room, military staff that was in the room. Were you in that meeting?